Welcome to another episode of the Dendrite podcast with Farnham and Saeed. This is a conversation with Dr. Georg Northoff, Canada researcher and the Director of Mind, Brain Imaging and Neuroethics at the Royal Institute of Mental Health Research and at the University of Ottawa.
During his scientific career, Dr. Northoff has worked at the intersection of psychiatry, neuroscience, and philosophy, resulting in over 260 journal articles and 15 books, developing theoretical and empirical frameworks to understand why and how our brain constructs subjective phenomena, such as self, consciousness, and emotions. His research is known for advancing spatiotemporal neuroscience, focusing on how the brain's intrinsic activity and temporal dynamics shape perception, cognition, and mental disorders.
His work spans neuroimaging, neurophenomenology, computational, and theoretical neuroscience with applications to conditions such as schizophrenia, depression, and disorders of consciousness. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now here's Dr. Georg Northoff.
Right. Hello, Dr. Northoff. Good evening, and thank you very much for giving us the time and being a guest in the podcast. We're really pleased to have this opportunity.
Yeah. Hello, good evening. You're welcome.
Okay, so let me just start off by asking about your background. How did you get interested into the whole neuroscience, philosophy, and psychiatry? And maybe if you can talk about your undergrad and going all the way back to your undergrad years.
Just early days.
Early days. How did it all got started in the beginning?
How did it get all started? Yeah. How did I get into that mess? So I started even earlier with high school. So I was very interested in high school in philosophy. That was really picked up my interest. And then I wanted to study philosophy, that was clear. But I didn't want to study it alone. So I wanted to study it with another science, with another discipline. So one, of course, obvious is mathematics, physics, and philosophy. It's, of course, the prime way. Another way, completely different, is philosophy and legal studies, law. And another study, of course, was philosophy and neuroscience. And at the time, surprise, surprise, there were no neuroscience programs around there. Neuroscience is a very little infant, just starting to walk, but often falling, and still does. And then I decided, so at the time it was also that what is called the mind-body problem relationship was really the big problem. John Eccles and Karl Popper, philosopher and neuroscientist, put themselves together, wrote a book. And so that was sort of, so at that time, then I went into the mind-body problem. And then, of course, I needed to study neuroscience for that, the brain. What do you study? If there's no neuroscience program around, you study medicine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had to go into medicine, and I started philosophy and medicine always in parallel. I could have not survived medicine without philosophy because it's such a strict and rigid curriculum, which is not for my more liberal mind. And so then I started that, and as I said, I often said, and then of course I always was interested in this brain-mind problem. And when I mean by mind-brain problem is really subjectivity. So subjectivity, where's experience coming from? You hear, or you heard probably many guys speaking about the background, oh God, this Northoff is so boring. So you have a certain feeling of boredom. And then I ask, where's this feeling of boredom coming from? Yeah. So it's not just a cognition, why do you have this feeling? And that really, what I call subjectivity, it really still sparks my interest, and that's why I studied medicine. And then, of course, when you study, I did this in parallel in Germany and in the US. And then, of course, with medicine, you need to do some kind of residency afterwards, because otherwise, basically, your degree is worthless. Mm-hmm. So then what is the closest to the mind-brain? So first I said, I want to go to the brain, so I went into neurology, but found it pretty boring, testing for reflexes and so on, and movement. Didn't interest me. So then I went into psychiatry, and I said, wow, this is really interesting, because it's crazy experiences. And because it really sheds a light on the extremes of your mind, and it still fascinates me. In particular, you can learn a lot from that. So because you see the range of the whole mind in these patients, and I must say, funny so, I still treat patients, and the longer I'm doing this, the more I feel I have all the diseases also in me. Yeah, so meaning we share something. It's just an extreme on a continuum, and that tells you a lot. And so I did my residency, and then afterwards I wanted to leave medicine because I couldn't take it. It's very rigid, very strict. It's more, medicine is a good discipline, but it's more craftsmanship. But I was interested in science and also thinking, philosophy.
If I may ask, how long was the residency for psychiatry?
It's 4 years. No, 5 years. 5 years.
5 years, and you had to do 3 years like before that, or 4 years before that, and then do the residency in psychiatry, or
what do you mean?
like I'm just wondering, did you like about the system in Germany? Is it the same as here? Like you have to do 4 years of medicine and then go be a specialized in psychiatry after, or is it like much different?
No, it's slightly different. So your high school is 2 years longer until 19.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's probably more like the Persian system where you come from.
Yeah.
So it's 2 years longer.
Okay.
That's the first 2 years of your bachelor, and the medical school is 6 years. The first 2 years is basically the last 2 years of your bachelor.
I see.
And then the clinical side is after 2 years in Germany. So ultimately it's the same, but slightly sliced up.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so then I did always philosophy in parallel. So then I did the residency, then I did my PhD in psychiatry, then I did my PhD in neuroscience, and then also in philosophy at some point. And after the residency, I wanted to get out because I couldn't stay there. I already had a grant for a PhD in biomedical ethics, actually in Montreal at the time, at McGill. Mm-hmm. But then I didn't go there because I got an offer to be attending at a psychiatric clinic where they had brain imaging. So fMRI. So for you guys, these colorful brain images you get is, of course, you take it for granted. It's a very young kid. So it was the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, was invented at the beginning of the 90s. So it was completely new. And I still remember when I was resident, of course, I immediately went and wanted to do the research. And I started already doing with psychomotor research. Catatonia is a particular mental psychiatric disorder.
Right.
So I did that because it's psychomotor, it's a paradigmatic mind-body disease, psychomotor. And very interesting, I saw these patients said, wow, this is really, they're completely frozen and they can't speak, but for intrapsychological reasons, so the movements are normal. It's not like Parkinson's disease. I compared them to Parkinson's disease. We did some ball experiments and all kinds of stuff. And the people are really frozen. They stand in bizarre postures for purely intrapsychological reasons. So we interviewed them and said, okay, many of these people have extreme anxiety. Yeah? So uncontrollable anxiety, and that makes them completely stiff. And then, I got this position then where they had, I had the opportunity becoming attending in psychiatry and also heading the brain imaging and developing this functional fMRI, and of course fascinating thing, finally I'm getting to the brain, so I did that. And I continued the philosophy in parallel. And
so was there any, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just wondering, was there any point in your journey that you were kind of thinking, I'm doing all different kind of stuff, wouldn't it be better to focus on one thing than focusing on many aspects? Because like us as a student, sometimes we get to the point and we're doing so many things and we think about it ourselves that maybe it could be better to just focus on one thing other than trying to focus on many things at the same time. Do you think, was there any point in your journey that you thought of that, or is it good to focus on many things at the same time or not?
Depends on the perspective. Of course, if you do everything and nothing, then it's not good.
Right.
But if you do different disciplines with a thematic structure, so my question was for brain and mind. Mm-hmm. So if you, for instance, want to study the relationship between brain and self, the concept of self, where does it come from in Western philosophy? So you look into philosophy. Right. Then you look into neuroscience, what is the neuronal mechanism of self, and then maybe the self is altered in psychiatric disturbances. So if you make these kind of connections, meaning thematically guided or topic-based connection, then interdisciplinary work is a must for me. And again, when you look into the history of science, there's always the link between theory and empirical data.
Right.
Yeah, that's what good science is. And so for me, always belong together. So it took me, I think, 20 years until this, 10 years ago, until I realized that other people see it differently, that I see them always different. So for me, I start from a completely different point of view, because for me they belong together because it's the same question.
Right.
These are just different methods. Yeah, either I come to you by car, by bike, or by motorbike or rollerblade. Yeah, but it's the same thing. Yeah, I go to your place. Yeah. So, but it really took me very, very long to understand that other people see it as completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and for me, any good science and philosophy should be topic, theme-based. That should guide you, and then you just look around, go shopping. How can I improve my theme? Or I go there and go there, and it's still there. I'm still fascinated. Now we're going into physics and he knows this, and computational modeling, which is another field. So colleagues would tell me, Georg, you're crazy. Do the one thing which you always did, and that's good for your career. Yeah, but it's not good for the science.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I was inclined to answer to your question because I see it here in Canada so much, and it's in Germany now too. At my time, it wasn't like that. Career. What do you need to do for the career? So you either listen to the science, and that takes a lot of time to listen to the science. What is necessary? What is the next logical step? So I spend a lot of time on that. Or I listen to the career advisor, and my science will be very different.
Yeah.
If I had been clever, listen to the career advisor, I would have still do self and cortical midline structures, for which I became known, and I would have done the last 20 years. My career would have been probably much better. My science would have been boring and goodbye. So you can imagine what I prefer. And it took me, again, very long time to understand it because I was just so much into my own scientific view. So,
Yeah, it definitely takes an effort to be able to see different perspectives. One thing that I think helps a lot is be able to keep in touch with people from other disciplines. For example, in case of like doing the podcast, you get to see the people who are doing like very hard-based computation or science, but also like humanities and psychology. But it's always good to as you mentioned, it definitely takes a lot of time, but if you do it right, it definitely pays off.
So scientifically it pays off. Now I'm really enjoying it because I can play the balls and I'm learning new balls.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating, and I have the feeling now this spatiotemporal approach, things come together. We'll probably come to that later. Career-wise, it's a catastrophe. So career-wise, if you come with 2 or 3 PhDs, you have sitting in the commissions, you have people with 1 PhD. Do you think they will take you? No way.
Right.
No way. That's academia. Yeah. Then it's also because for me it always belonged together. So I have philosophical concept, I have scientific, empirical concepts, and not realizing that they either want philosophical concepts or the other concepts. Yeah. So that makes it very difficult. That sometimes many people say my writings are difficult. Yeah. So in that sense, it takes you longer. It's a tough way, but it's a fascinating way. And now I really enjoy this. I mean, now I think, wow, it's coming together. And as I said, look into the history of science. Any good science. I mean, I think I said it to you earlier. I can't remember. Before there was empirical discovery of Galileo and Kepler, there was a Copernicus who formulated mathematical theory. In the case of Darwin, it was the other way around. But even he had a certain model. If he hadn't had this model, he couldn't go there to Galapagos and see the similarities between different species, which completely was beyond and outside the viewpoint at the time. That's why you need other disciplines involved.
No, this looking through different lenses, we'll get to it quite frequently across the discussion. Now, we can now go back and see where it started to emerge. So at the end of psychiatry, starting to see starting to be able to look at the brain with empirical data, with fMRI, and then starting to get other measurements. So And then you also mentioned a very interesting aspect about psychiatry, to be able to see psychiatric disorders and see how brain and mind are manifested or interconnected at the extremes. So could you talk a bit about that and how, because we're on the road to get to the spatiotemporal neuroscience. I wanted to see how that little by little is emerging. That's a
difficult question. Yeah, so let's say, okay, I do this a little bit chronologically. I mean, for me, it was always about subjectivity, experience. Little I knew, and for me, the concept of self was a placeholder for that. But little I knew at the time that self was considered a higher order cognitive function, just one function besides others. But for me, it's like the floor here upon which all the tables and chairs stand. So the traditional and still predominating view that the self is one of the chairs, but for me it's the floor. But I didn't know that. So and it's interesting how people read me. That people read me as a proponent of a higher order cognitive self, which I realized 10 years, 15 years later. Yeah. So how did all that emerge? I mean, I did a lot of brain imaging. I started with this catatonia, psychomotor, and investigated their brain imaging. And I also asked them about their subjective experience. So out of that resulted some catatonia scales, both for subjective experience and for psychomotor behavior, which are now standard in clinical routine use. And also we did brain imaging on that, yeah, because I really said it's not just a motor disorder like Parkinson's disease, but it's really a psychomotor disorder where intrapsychological processes transform into abnormal motor behavior. For instance, when you have extreme anxiety, you cannot control yourself, or extreme emotions. I had tragically one patient, it was really tragic, 5 times she fell in love, each time she became catatonic. Yeah, each time, because she couldn't control her emotions of happiness. It was too much, and she hadn't the capacity to control it. So it's really extreme emotions. And so that was for me a fantastic example how subjective experience transforms into objective behavior / movements. Yeah. And it's literally true. Yeah. And that's of course diagnostically and therapeutically extremely relevant. Yeah. And yeah, so then I did that, and I continued that also when I was then I was 5 years in US at Harvard University. I somewhat continued that. I did some other research, and then I was attending again in Germany. So I said then I somewhat continued, then I widened it, and then I really started all this research on the self. And I said that the self is sort of for me an expression, as I said earlier, it's a basic subjectivity. And then I get with that, and I think that probably addresses the question you answered, I assume.
You mentioned the brain imaging aspect of this whole area of research. How do you think it got developed throughout the years, and what are the challenges are we facing now with the whole brain imaging field?
Yeah, brain imaging first is it's a term for various modalities. One modality actually is quite old, electroencephalography, EEG, which goes back to 1929, Hans Berger in Germany. And he observed some waves in the brain, here in the surface of your head, with electrodes. And then new imaging techniques already emerged. So that was early. That was basically the main tool from in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s. And then, of course, people developed an intracranial recording. And on the human side, then there was developed what is called positron emission tomography, PET, where you measured the glucose, for instance, and also different biochemical substances, ligands. But that was very expensive, also combined with radioactivity. That was sort of in the 80s, last century came up. And then in the 90s, beginning of the 90s, I said I was part of that, the functional magnetic resonance imaging came, fMRI. And that really opened it because no radioactivity, it was cheaper than PET, it's still expensive. And then really opened because you suddenly see You basically could see the rhythm of your movement, you could see the corresponding changes in your neuronal activity. Yeah. And that was enormous because suddenly you had insight into what happens in the brain. So then all the cognitive people mapped all their cognitive function, attention, memory, blah, 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 onto different networks and regions in the brain. And yeah, and that has really been developed. And the problem is, of course, what is the physiological basis of that signal? Is it related to neuronal activity? Because it basically measures the discrepancy between oxygen and disoxygen in the brain. And another modality came, magnetic encephalography, is let's say, refined version of EEG. And the PET, the positron emission tomography, also developed. Yeah, what are the challenges? I mean, one thing is really important. You need to know what exactly you want to measure, what these modalities measure, the impact of the measurement device itself. Physicists know this very well. Neuroscientists, in their enthusiasm, tend to neglect that. And then, of course, it's really not clear whether it's fine-grained enough. Now there's a lot of computational modeling, and you mentioned you had some earlier colleagues of mine into computational modeling. So now you combine that, get a little bit more into the fine-grained, deeper underlying mechanisms of the brain. And I think, for me, that's the way to go. And I hope there's also technological development of better measurement instruments. However, what we don't really know about the brain is what on earth is the purpose of the brain? What is the functionality of the brain?
That was a follow-up question.
We do not know. Yeah, so in the case of the heart, we know it's a pumping organ, but that's not trivial. That was found out in the 17th century by an English guy. Yeah, what is the purpose of the kidney? Cleaning blood. What is the purpose of the stomach? Digesting food. So now, imagine, you weren't knowing that the heart is a pumping organ. You weren't knowing that the kidney is cleaning blood. You have no idea. Why is there muscle in the case of the heart? Why is it constantly contracting? Why are there 4 different pipes? I hope I got it right. And why is there an electrical system which constantly incites these strange movements? What is this? And then there is flowing blood. Yeah, why? So same in the kidney. Why do you have all these fine-grained organizations, this filtration system? You wouldn't know. That's the state in the case of the brain. We do not know. You would not understand the organization of the heart. Once you know the functionality, the biological role, you say, wow, that makes sense. Brilliant. Thank you, nature. Yeah, we don't know that in the case of the brain. Of course, I have my ideas, but I don't tell you. And yeah, we don't know. So meaning you don't really know the basic thing which probably put some sense and meaning on the organization of the brain.
And also that gets connected that, well, when we don't actually know all the different aspects of it or the all-encapsulating role of it, then how can we understand pathology? How can we understand all different psychiatric diseases that we know of? And that gets to the other question that you've mentioned this in quite a lot of lab meetings, wherever you want to give an example. You give an example of glucose, that, well, you take the blood, you measure that. We need something also for that brain, for all to be able to diagnose. So how can we approach finding such a thing? How can we, like, in between all this question marks, like, how can we approach trying to understand how it's supposed to work? Then, okay, so what is pathology now? And how can we diagnose it? And how can we figure out where to go from there?
Yeah, first, purpose for the brain, of course, there are assumptions. Now there's a big assumption these days. The brain is a predictive organ. It's the purpose of prediction. But that's, for me, that's by Carl Frisson, who's a brilliant guy and I know him in person. But I think that's, for me, only the upper half of the story, because that's a very cognitive view, and I cannot imagine that biology invented a brain just for prediction. I don't think that's more or less a very anthropocentric projection on the poor brain. And how can you develop that? I mean, you have different, as I understood your question, is sort of a question on what kind of evidences, lines of evidence you draw in order to find something out about the purpose of the brain, and then also apply it to mental disorders. So my lines of evidence are both philosophical, conceptual models, empirical plausibility. Is the cognitive model of the brain really plausible, empirically, conceptually? Is my spatiotemporal model or other models, how do they fare with regard to the history, with the other models? And that is always, you have always, Thomas S. Kuhn, when you really have change in science, you have a paradigm shift. You do not just have a shift, some new empirical data, but empirical data make you see the same thing in a new way. That's a paradigm shift. When you put it in large, it's a Copernican revolution. It makes you see things in a different light, meaning you see more. Yeah? Suddenly Darwin saw that there are similarities between species. Before, we only saw the differences between the species. Suddenly he was able to say, look, we are not that different from a monkey. Catastrophe. Yeah, and still catastrophe many people. I said, great, it's a liberation. We no longer need to be special. And actually we are doing something similar now for the self, where we compare macaque, chimpanzee and humans. And we see exactly this kind of evolutionary differentiation. So philosophy is one large point. The neuroscience is the one large evidence. I go a lot into basic research. Physics, as far as I understand it, physics, engineering, but that's not where I'm coming from. He knows I have a lot of deficits there. And then, of course, psychiatry, because psychiatry gives you an idea of what is possible. Yeah, it gives you the whole range of possible phenomena. And that can give you an idea how the brain must function in order to be able to produce these kinds of strange symptoms like delusions, hallucination, abnormal sadness, I need to kill myself because I'm guilty, and things like that. Yeah? So these are sort of the lines of evidence I'm relying on, and that really guides me, and still.
Could you dig deeper a little bit into the neuroscience aspect of it, and maybe if you can explain a little bit what are you working on in your lab currently to see how can we make sense of that whole model, and how, like,
I think it's better to first start with spatiotemporal neuroscience.
Or along that way.
With the theory.
Now, with whom shall I now establish good relationship? With you or who? This question shall I answer? Good. I do them together. Okay. Yeah. So one thing is, I already mentioned the cognitive model that the self is basically one share among others. But that model could not really explain for me for experience. So experience, consciousness, experience often subsumed under consciousness in the Western tradition. In your Eastern tradition, it's slightly different. Experience is a much broader, consciousness is used in a broader way. So that's very important. These are cultural differences which also have a lot of impact on me. So because I'm interested in subjective experience, in the wider sense of the term, why do we experience anything at all? And experience is here not just limited to what is called consciousness in the Western world, defined by qualia, phenomenal qualities, what it is like. It's a much broader, it's an experience of ourselves as wider, part of the wider world as a whole. So it's a much more Asian-based tradition, as I would see, because I'm often in the Chinese world. I have a lot of impact on that. They have a lot of impact on me. And so I was always interested in that question, and that the traditional models, both in philosophy and in neuroscience, the cognitive model, then came a computational model, parallel distributed processing, and blah, 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 computer-like model, were never really satisfying to me. I always missed something. And also as a psychiatrist, because that's the litmus test. Can your models explain mental disorders? Every model which cannot account for mental disorder misses some aspect of the mind. Yeah, because you do not just want to have a healthy mind, the mind also includes the extremes. And that sort of really this, and then I give you a concrete example. In psychiatry, they did all this cognitive testing, attention, different forms of attention, executive functions, memory. Nothing of that is specific for any disorder. Nothing of that has entered clinical reality as a diagnostic marker. So something is missing in our model. And of course, Northoff would say, that's the subjectivity. Because you ban the subjectivity as an add-on to your otherwise seemingly objective cognitions. So now the cognitive people will hate me for what I'm saying. For me, yes, I see why the cognitive approach is a development as an answer to behaviorism. Behaviorism was just input, output, stimulus, response. Consciousness was acknowledged, but said it's too complex, banned, out. Then the cognitive approach said, no, it's not just input-output relation, stimulus, response, but there are cognitive functions sandwiched in between. That brought back in consciousness into the Western debate. And now, of course, consciousness was associated with cognitive functions. However, early on I said, this is not consciousness. Consciousness is not just attention. Consciousness is not just working memory. There's still many theories around who claim that. Said yes, I would say yes, they maybe have a very small area where they write, but the basic phenomenon itself, they're insufficient. So that led me to really investigate other alternative models. And I went through a lot, and you see this in my earlier books and writings. It's a happy chaos, and because you're searching, so you sense something, it's insufficient, but you don't know really why. But you sense this, and then you explicate that. And yeah, I think I answered that question for that, and then okay, go ahead.
If you I'm sure Saeed have a great idea by now, what are the things that he works on. But for our audience,
we can judge that one later.
for our audience and myself too, what is it that you are working with to see if it's missing or not? What is it that all the cognitive models have in common, or what do they miss, at least that relates to subjectivity of that thing?
Okay, so fair question. Now I become a little bit more concrete, finally. So very concrete. So for me, self is subjectivity. Mm-hmm. So what we earlier observed, that the self overlaps with a particular set of regions in the brain, here in the middle of the brain. We call them cortical midline structures, and they are the core regions of what Marcus Reckley introduced as the default mode, the regions of the default mode. Then later that became known as the default mode network. And so I observed that, and I said, wow, maybe these regions are involved in all kinds of different cell functions, in the motor area, in autobiographical memory, in attention. So that was an earlier paper in cognitive science in 2004, and that's when there is an overlap. So then another step at the time point that these regions, these cortical midline structures, were very closely related to resting state activity, to high resting state activity. And then we and others observed, wow, these regions of the self overlap with those regions which show high resting state activity. Resting state activity means spontaneous activity, no specific task. Your brain is just left alone. Yeah, your supervisor leaves you alone. You can finally do mind wandering, whatever you want. Okay, that's the spontaneous activity state. Yeah, and that is measured what is called resting state. So the resting state is not truly a resting state; it's an imaginary. So I said, wow, there's an overlap between resting state. And then we had another follow-up paper in 2011, and in 2008 we said, wow, maybe here my self doing a task state has a strong impact on my subsequent resting state. And we have this real overlap in the cortical midline structure / default mode network between self and resting state. And I said, wow, maybe your resting state or your spontaneous activity, this has something to do with subjectivity. So here you see I already divert from the mainstream, because I said, maybe self is just a specific function, it's an internal cognition. No, for me it was a baseline. So then I said, wow, maybe your spontaneous activity is the baseline of any kind of task activity. That's, again, the floor idea of this room. And then I said, okay, if that is the case, if you have an overlap between resting state / spontaneous activity and self, then let's go one step further and say, maybe your resting state activity predicts the self. And then, of course, you say, yeah, what properties in the resting state? Because you don't have an amplitude, evoked amplitude, task-related amplitude, as usually task activities measure. You don't have a specific amplitude. What do you do? What kind of measures do you do? So, and then I said, yeah, what happens in the spontaneous activity? You have a certain spatial structure and temporal dynamics, meaning changing patterns over time. So I said, wow, in order to be able to predict, maybe the self is predicted psychologically, self-consciousness or identity predicted by your spontaneous activity, then of course you say, yeah, what features? So then I said, okay, then how can I measure these temporal patterns? Dynamic changing patterns. There's nothing in neuroscience. So I went to engineering. So I went my early adventures into engineering, and I even hired engineers. So I basically learned with my students. You just, as a supervisor, you're always a step behind or ahead to fake it. And that's the way it is. So we went into all these measures like autocorrelation function, scale-free dynamic, power law exponent, and so on and so forth. And then indeed, we did this in EEG. We said, wow, look, yourself, self-consciousness, we had a self-consciousness scale, and we have a self-task, and a different variation is predicted by these temporal structures in the resting state. Wow, that is cool. So then maybe it's the temporal structure which shapes your experience. And then also for conscious states, we did similar things, but it was sort of more cloudy. And then I said, maybe what is in the resting state is specific as intrinsic features of the spontaneous activity, meaning what defines the spontaneous activity as spontaneous activity, that's intrinsic. That means maybe it's intrinsic spatial organization / topography, and it's intrinsic temporal organization / dynamics. So, and that's basically, then I said, maybe mental phenomena, including psychiatric disturbances, are spatiotemporal disturbances. So then I wrote a paper in 2016, 2 papers back-to-back, spatiotemporal psychopathology. And I remember I submitted that paper first to another journal, and the reviewer said, it's trivial. That hurt me. That really hurt me. It took me 2 years to understand why they said it's trivial, because they thought I talk about outer time and space, and then it's trivial. But I talk about the inner time and space of the brain. So now, how could I come up with that idea? The inner time of space and the brain. That goes back to philosophy and Immanuel Kant, famous German philosopher, 17th, 18th century, or 18th, 19th century. Yeah? So he spoke of an inner time and space in our mind. And indeed, I wrote a paper in 2012, Immanuel Kant and the brain's resting state. And there I made the case for inner time and space. So you see it all, and then of course, and I get the conceptual ideas, then I do the empirical ideas, then I refine my conceptual model, and it goes happy back and forth, back and forth. And that's science. Science is not this kind of a priori pseudo-hypothesis driven, what they tell you at the beginning of your PhD, you need to fix all your hypotheses, and that determines what you do the next 4 years. It's good for the career, it's good for the assembly line, it's good for the scientific industry, it's not good for science. Sorry, science doesn't work this way.
It's dynamic.
That's also a good thing. Yeah, it's dynamic. And so you see it's step by step, and each step depends upon the previous. And now in retrospect, when I tell this sounds so logical. Yeah, because it really makes sense, Northoff. Maybe I buy your spatiotemporal neuroscience. Yeah, maybe. Trust me, each step when you're ahead of it takes a long time.
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah. You go a lot of detours here and you don't know, but when you're there, it's a beautiful experience. And now, because I did all these different things, now I just thoroughly enjoy them.
So it's all coming together.
Yeah,
maybe we can talk about a bit more about time. So the inner time, the outer time, the perception of time scale, intrinsic time, it appears to be really important, the perception of it. How is it related? How is time manifested in the interplay of brain and mind and the environment? So particularly, maybe I talked about a lot of things, but the perception of time.
Now, of course, you're Persian. You want right into the metaphysics of the universe. Yeah, I know you guys. It's a compliment. So, yeah, time. So I think first, really, what is outer time, inner time? So a car is passing by, that's the outer time. Mm-hmm. However, I can perceive that the same speed of the car, one's very slow and one's very fast. Or you perceive it as fast, I perceive it as slow. How is that possible? Same objective time, different subjective time. How is that possible? And it's now clear that we use, the brain has its own inner time scale, certain processes, durations. Yeah? Various time scales where it fluctuates, it's continuous wave, big waves, slow waves, fast waves, small waves, all kinds of waves, fluctuations, oscillations. And not only oscillation, also aperiodic fluctuations. Yeah? And that creates a time, the inner time of the brain. Now, for instance, in depression, your brain becomes literally too slow. Literally. Yeah? You can measure that. You're engineers with median frequencies and other measures. Yeah? Your brain is too slow, particularly here, your visual cortex. We showed this in various studies. So now, if your inner time, let's say, of your visual cortex is too slow, you will not be able to perceive fast movements. Because what the brain does, it matches its inner time with the outer time. Right. So the speed here is related to the speed of the change in my brain. Yeah? And that's remarkable. How the brain matches and adapts and aligns its own inner dynamics to the dynamics of the external input / the probability distributions of the external input is unbelievable. That's really, we haven't learned much of that because we all focus inside. We don't focus in the relation. And the brain really uses its own inner dynamics in a very active sense, its inner time to match with the outer time. Now, if my inner time is too slow, it's a mismatch. I'm depressed. I'm always too slow. If my brain is too fast, my inner time, then I'm manic. Because I'm not sick. You're too slow, guys. And you call that manic? You're crazy. Yeah? Mm-hmm. That's the manic. That's why it's so certain. There's no way that you can go against the certainty of the psychiatric patients. Yeah? And so actually we wrote a paper, Too Slow, Too Fast, and we could really show this, that the inner time also on the neuronal level is too slow. And that's really key. And I think we haven't much, and that of course the inner time leads you back to the brain's spontaneous activity. And that's for me, it creates dynamic pattern, dynamic repertoire, and continuously matching with the outer time and changes in the outer world. And then of course the next thing, what I say, okay, maybe this inner time of the brain also structures the time of our consciousness. Yeah? When you have consciousness, your thoughts are constantly changing. For me as a researcher, it's a nightmare. I have a thought and then a fleeting thought, it disappears. A nightmare. So I always have a little pen in my sheet of paper with me so that I capture that thought. Yeah? It's painful because, of course, I don't want, the thought is, of course, so brilliant. I don't want to lose it. Yeah. I'm joking. So it's amazing because there's an inner dynamic to your consciousness. So that, again, goes back to philosophy, phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, beginning of the 20th century, inner time consciousness. So you see how neuroscience, psychiatry, and philosophy, and then of course engineering and physics, because you have an engineer background, come really together. Yeah. So, and that's absolutely key. And I think and that inner time, I think that's really, and that of course spatiotemporal neuroscience then. And then I say, maybe there's a shared temporal and spatial features between consciousness and brain. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, world. So that's why we speak of a common currency. It's a paper we first published in 2020. Now we publish an update paper. And that has been taken up a lot, because I think that's really a novel model of brain and mind. Because usually the mind is something specific, and then some specific brain property. I say, no, they share something, time and space, without reducing them. Yeah, and then of course you bring also the world in there. And that's really, I think, the core, or the heart, or the brain of the spatiotemporal approach. Yeah, that's a sharing, conceptually, theoretically, that's a sharing. So how does that look like? You say, okay, Northoff, go home as a philosopher, we're not interested in that. This common currency, very concrete. We show, let's say, entropy, high entropy on the neuronal level relates directly to high entropy on the behavioral or psychological level. We had a recent paper in music listening where we showed that the slow-fast frequency balance in the brain, measured by median frequency, directly causally, grander causality, relates to fluctuations in your emotional experience over time. That's same, again, slow-fast frequencies of those emotional assessments, experience, relate to slow-fast frequency fluctuations on the neuronal. That's common currency, and that's probably the way how neuronal activity is transformed into mental activity.
And that's the beauty of it, because, well, in that particular example, we can see, well, quote-unquote, the alignment of the environment and the neuronal basis of the brain and the mind. And that I really find that interesting, because when I think about it, like the whole reason now, well, I'm doing some stuff in this lab, I still trying to understand, but how I got interested and what's still driving me is when I think about it, because it's tapping into the core question of human existence, like the thrownness that we experience, like in the environment. How is the alignment? How do we exist in this environment? It appears to be like the question, its own answer. The question of how these two are, how the brain, how I as a person perceive myself and exist in my day-to-day life and connect with myself with the environment and interact. This interaction appears to be what allows me to have this consciousness and this subjectivity of mine. As you mentioned, the ground, the self as the ground, which wouldn't make sense without an environment and wouldn't be able to do anything without any connection with it. So we can, from the very small stuff that I have understood, any sort of disturbance in this will be manifested in another side as well. And the way that it connects to the common currency, that interests me. That when you see a disturbance on the neuronal side, well, you can sort of, within the same dynamics, you can sort of see that on the subjective side as well. And also, I'm speaking very entropically, but another question that we have later is that how can we understand this or perceive this in relation to culture and art? And it was the name of one of the papers. I'm trying to find it. Yeah. So that
maybe before we jump into that, you mentioned there's a time difference. For example, in case of depression, our brain is slower than the environment, or the stimuli, for example, is fast, but the connection in our brain is slower. I wonder if you want to treat that, would you go internally? As I assume probably the drugs make your brain faster and kind of help this dynamic to become normal internally, but is there any way that you can maybe from outside maybe bring that slower or bring it down to align with your brain that is already slower? How do we go about it? Do we go internally or externally to fix, for example, a situation like depression?
Okay, let me answer both questions because I want to keep good relations. I want to align to both. So I start with him first, with the slowness. That goes obviously back to Martin Heidegger, philosopher at the 20th century, dramatically existential. thrown into the walls. That's, of course, there was also another component in there. But we are and we are not thrown. Yes, we are thrown, literally and figuratively. But we are not, because our brain is a very active organ and constantly actively aligns ourselves. There would be an absolute throwness if our brain were just a passive organ. But it actively modulates any kind of input process. Any. And so it's an active alignment. So the brain is not completely hopeless, thrown and exposed to what happens. It filters. Yeah? It filters. And let's say, for instance, you hear music. You hear all these tones. Your brain aligns to the rhythm of the music and you dance to the rhythm, and then suddenly you get into the structure of the music. Your brain is stable. It's not thrown anymore. It throws itself into the music, but by aligning to the structure of the music, it gets the structure of the music and stability. And you can literally measure that in the brain. It's amazing. Yeah? So even after the exposure of music, and in animal studies has been shown, you see the same activation pattern, same stimulus dynamic pattern. Yeah. So it's remarkable. So I would not say it's an active. Where you're coming close to what is thrown is probably in some of the psychiatric disorders. That's why they're so painful, because there's this active alignment is impeded. Suddenly I cannot perceive the fast stuff anymore. I cannot align to it anymore. Of course I'm frustrated. Yeah, of course I'm frustrated. Yeah. So, and what do? I socially withdraw. I doubt upon myself. I become depressed. So, meaning the symptoms of depression, which often are supposed to explain by higher order cognitive function, prefrontal cortex and emotional regulation, amygdala, probably go back to some basic problems in input processing. And indeed, we showed that. Yeah. So I don't say that the emotional and cognitive accounts of depression as a mood disorders are wrong, but they only capture one aspect. Yeah? You need a broader aspect. So now what we're trying to do with our dynamic measures, our speed measures, we try to predict the cognitive measures. So I think that's very, very important. And you see again, for me it's always fascinating how much philosophical theory is there, but also how much hardcore empirical science is there, because all what I'm saying, we went to engineering and physics. We don't go with much of what neuroscience has to offer. Yeah, and we had a very interesting lab meeting exactly about this yesterday. Yeah, so how can you change that? So of course, so throughout all of this is what I call spatiotemporal psychopathology and also spatiotemporal neuroscience. Basically, just published a paper, Brain Dynamics Shapes Cognition. That's spatiotemporal neuroscience. Yeah? And indeed, we show how working memory, attention, suddenly I do cognitive functions. Never done that in my life. Now they're shaped. Yeah? Okay, bingo. That's the pieces of the puzzle I need to show in order to validate my model. So, and another piece of the puzzle is, can you modulate, can you therapeutically intervene? Because if I intervene with spatiotemporal means, and I change the mental state, you can argue whatever you want. You can you're crazy, your model is stupid, go home, the damn thing works. It's like, engineer, you built the car works, or you must have done something wrong. So, and in addition, which is more and more on my personal agenda, that I really want to do something for psychiatry, because psychiatry is a trial and error. You go to the doctor, 5 minutes talking, some little scale, and then you get a pill. Yeah, and the pill, okay, can this one be, or get some psychotherapy. When you go to a heart doctor, cardiology, you get 2 days of diagnostic, then you get a diagnosis, and you get a personally tailored therapy. Mm-hmm. So my hope is that some of my spatiotemporal stuff, meaning spatiotemporal markers, can serve for that. So I give you asked for the intervention. So one thing, for instance, depression is a speed disorder. Depression is too slow. Anxiety, people are too fast and too irregular. You can measure that again with tools from engineering. Now I know why. Now you know why I like engineering. So we can measure this with various forms of entropy, prediction disorder, irregularity, too high irregularity, entropy, various. Yeah. So for instance, anxiety is an irregularity disorder. It's too irregular and too fast. Then you want to introduce some slow waves into the brain. How can you do that? One way is, for instance, through breathing. You breathe slow. So, of course, breathing techniques have been done a lot in your part of the world, in India and in China, and also here now. So now when you look up online, you say, okay, the standard slow breathing rate is 6 breaths per minute. Okay, so we said, yeah, we test different breathing rates. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 breaths per minute. And we test it while they sit in EEG, measure entropy, and we also have some psychological visual analog scales. And then we said which breathing rate, it's the best breathing rate for our anxiety patients, which of these seven breathing rates. And what we found, sample of 50 subjects, that the standard slow breathing rate was only by 10% of the patients. The other 90% had 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, but not 6. So 6 is good for the average, for the group, not good for the individual subject. So we call this titration, breathing, personalized breathing rate, and then we developed an app, and they get this app and do the breathing each day, twice 10 minutes, morning and evening, in their personalized breathing rate. They come back after 3 weeks, and then we measure them. And also before, after the 10 minutes, we have 2 little visual analog scales to measure the immediate effects. So, and we had very good effects. We had 20 to 30% after 10 minutes of breathing, and reliable in 90% of all the sessions over 6 weeks, which is amazing because this reliability and you have immediate effects, particularly for anxiety, is extremely important. So I give you one clinical example. One of my patients was actually a brilliant engineer, very, very brilliant woman. I learned a lot from her. But she had social anxiety. Of course, it's a disaster. Yeah, if you're an academic, you need to give public talks. You cannot have social anxiety. So she couldn't give talks. And then I said, okay, do the breathing rate and do the breathing. Go just briefly to the restroom, do your breathing for 5 minutes, a personalized breathing rate. Then she could give the talks. So that tells you how much you can help. And after 3 weeks and 6 weeks, we had about improvement rates about 40 to 50%. Just with simple breathing, it was a severe anxiety patient. And what does this tell us? So when you personalize, you need to personalize the breathing because only 10% had the standard breathing. Your brain is different from mine. What for you is slow speed is probably for me fast speed, and vice versa. So my baseline is completely different. Speaking of baseline, remember we had that before, the self. And the baseline obviously is a spatial temporal baseline. What is your topography? What is your dynamics? Sorry. And then we compared our efficacy rates with the efficacy rates where they used the same scales of pharmaco and psychotherapy. We had similar rates. So this is, you see here an example how the spatial temporal approach, we make the brain more regular, we reduce the entropy, by that we relieve the anxiety. That's a mechanism. And you see therapeutically it results in a personalization. Yeah? If you know my baseline speed and my baseline irregularity, you know what it means when I have anxiety. Yeah, you can infer that, but if you don't know that, then you don't know. So, and other forms of intervention, of course, now we also do the same for music. So we develop a music protocol where we really vary the speed of the music, and we will also now vary the regularity of the music to address speed disorders like depression and irregularity disorders like anxiety. Yeah. So, and then of course other interventions will go into the future for magnetic stimulation, personalized, again on the topography of the brain, which region best changes the topography, overall topography of the brain. And also we do some computational modeling in artificial neural networks.
So I wonder what would be the relationship, because for example, when we talk about breathing exercise, it's good for both depression and anxiety, but those are two different things. In anxiety, you have a higher activity, but in depression, it's the opposite. But meditation or breathing exercise still work for both. How come is that? Like, why does it work for both if they're different?
Good question. So nothing is easy when it comes to mental disorders. So you can have depression with and without anxiety, and anxiety with and without depression. So I know it's a nice escape answer. It's fair. So that's why you need to personalize.
Right.
You need to enter to the moment also. For instance, we saw that the optimal breathing rate changes after 3 weeks. It's plastic. Yeah, it's an adaptation. Yeah, and after 6 weeks. So again, you see, it's dynamic. And same with meditation. So our idea is to personalize the therapy, develop biomarkers, and personalization of both pharmacological and non-pharmacological therapies. So pharmacological, non-pharmacological, you already heard, music and breathing. And the other one is indeed meditation. So we ran a study in Italy and in India now also, where we compare different forms of meditation with each other. And interesting, in Italy, it's very interesting, was one subject, she was a Zen monk. So in Zen, you know, it's a tough form, it's very austere, very sparse. These are tough people. And so we confronted her with 4 different forms of meditation, and one of the meditation forms is a certain breathing exercise, vipassana, and breath watching. And she didn't like that at all. So she was 20 years already a Zen monk. She couldn't tolerate that form of meditation. Why? Because 25 years ago, she was exposed to that and got some traumatic experiences. Some earlier trauma experience resurfaced when she did that meditation. Here you see how important it is to personalize. Even for 20 years. Zen monk. Yeah, I mean, you would have assumed that she would develop so much capacity to deal with that. Incredible. Your brain keeps the score. It doesn't forget anything.
Interesting. If you can go back a little bit about the whole dynamic of default mode network, resting state, and the self idea.
Getting back to the core.
Before you mentioned you were seeing the resting state activity and how the dynamic changed, but also when you were doing self-task related things. I want to ask you, what are the self-tasks would look like, or at least if you can explain a little bit more about what kind of activity do we compare the resting activity to?
Yeah, I mean, self, of course, is a heterogeneous concept which you can measure in different ways.
Sorry, before that, is the default mode network same as resting state?
Some people assume that,
Right.
and I think they still assume that. No. One is a network, simple, nowadays defined as a web network, and the other one is a certain state of activity. So
Right.
this is just conceptually also 2 different stories. And it's clear that the default mode net was long assumed to be synonymous with resting state, which was completely stupid, because the resting state is throughout the whole brain. Your visual cortex has a resting state too. So that's a very naive assumption of the cognitive people, who assume basically a module-like characterization of the brain. You have a module for the resting state, a module for attention, a module for working memory. I mean, nothing. The brain, if this brain would sit here on the table, it would say, how stupid are you? So this is just unbelievable. But that is the background model which is hidden behind the way they do their experimental data. Recently there was a paper in Nature this year in March about anterior versus posterior regions, which are cortical regions, which are related to consciousness. I mean, this is medieval. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say, I hope nobody hears that it was part of that paper. And this is, for me, it's just, I shake my head. Yeah. As I said, the brain would smile and say, continue. You will not find out anything about it. Yeah, I mean, this is just, nature doesn't work that way. And Yeah. So how can you measure the self? You can show your own face. You can show your own voice. You can, we did all that. You can also attribute, say, okay, a certain shape is associated now with yourself, just mentally, and the triangle is associated with yourself, and the circle is not. And then in the next block, you say, now the circle is associated with yourself, and the triangle is not self. Self-association task developed by J. Zui, I think it's an absolute brilliant task, because it really tells that the self is not within a particular content or stimulus, like the circle or the triangle, but is related, is how you relate to that. Yeah, whether I consider it to be self-related to me or not. And that yields remarkable differences, both in psychological and neuronal changes. So, and that really led me to say, look, it's how you relate to the external input that marks yourself. And that, of course, is a spatiotemporally shaped process. And that means the self is a very basic feature of our mental life. It's not just one cognitive functions and other.
So the opposite, the baseline.
Goes back to the baseline, that's why we have this basis model of self-specificity as distinguished from the higher order cognitive model.
And we can talk a bit about writing. So you write a lot, starting from like grants to papers to books. What is your relationship with writing?
Of course, it's a hate-love affair, yeah. On the one hand, I love it. It can also be very tough. And I mean, of course, I wouldn't have written as much if I wouldn't enjoy it. Deep down, I'm a philosopher. That was my starting point. So that's where I'm coming from. No, I still enjoy that in developing ideas and methods, and it's basically an active thinking process. Yeah. Sometimes one sees this in my writings, unfortunately. So it's yeah.
Since you're the kind of person who have very broad interests, I wonder, is there any hobby other than lab stuff, which your lab already covers a lot of stuff, but I wonder if you have any other hobby or interest other than this field that you want to share?
Oh God, I mean, of course, science, I mean, it's in a way my life, particularly when you develop a completely different model, you go against the mainstream and development model. There's a lot of, you need to be very tough for that, because the kind of feedback you get is not always the best one. That's put politely. But now I'm really, it's the best time in my life as a scientist, because I really enjoy this. I mean, I finally found a puzzle which I need to buy, of course, called Spatiotemporal Puzzle, and now I put the different pieces of the puzzle together, and I go, wow, how stupid were you? That part belongs there, not here. So, but that was not the question. So I really enjoy this, and this is my life. Yeah, I don't want to use the concept of passion because it's so misused these days, and it's so fake use. I don't want to use that. I hate it. It's such a utilitarian context which simply doesn't fit the bill here. Hobbies, of course, music. My partner is a musician, so we have a lot of music, and at home there's no science, there's only music. So if you have a musician as a partner, an artist, there's no way that there's anything else but art at home. There's no place for science, I beg your pardon, let alone philosophy. That's where artists are. So music, of course, is wonderful. And the other thing, I do a lot of sports. So I run, I rollerblade, I bike, so that I do it daily. Certain days even twice.
Nice, interesting.
And
yeah.
traveling. I love traveling. I'm travel addicted. Unfortunately, my professional life leads me around a lot to different parts of the world, and also students from all over the world. There's a world map. You can take a photo later and include it. So that's a wonderful thing. That I learn. For me, learning is nothing more interesting than learning something. That makes my day. If I learn something, I understood something, that makes my day. You could give me millions, it doesn't make money. What really makes me happy when I understood something. And I learn something, I take on my own, I can think about, maybe it's like this, yeah, and that's science, that's philosophy.
That would be the toughest or easiest question of all. What's the meaning of life, if there is any?
You really become existential here. What is the meaning of life? I mean, for me, the answer is trying to understand life in nature. That's for me a broad meaning, which goes directly together with what I said before, as I said. So at some point, of course, you have all these lurings, and they try to lure you and tickle your narcissism. You're so important, you need to submit here, you can be reviewer here, your editor here, and you can go to conference and you can present your poster. Nothing of all that means anything to me anymore. And of course, it's very hard to find your way through it, because people don't really use it to make you happy. They use it just for their own purposes. Yeah. Academia is brutal in that, and how it uses other people. The administration uses other people. Your colleagues use you for their purposes. It's a brutal business and absolutely despicable for me. I can only say that. And for me, the really turning point was, I remember I got a very prestigious offer as a vice dean in Singapore, which would have been a highly paid position and very prestigious university, top Asian university, and blah, 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 all the usual stuff. And I went there, saw Singapore, which was nice, but I didn't like it. But anyway, and it was so clear that I was rejected, because it would have not given me the time to develop science. And since then, I don't care about all of this anymore. Yeah, so since I feel really free. Mm-hmm. That's completely paradoxical. So of course I pay a very high price, because I don't play the academic political game with commissions and this and that. But I'm scientifically absolutely free. Since then, I'm really enjoying, and it feels to me that I really reached sort of a very deeper inner core of mine there. I must say, I'm really a happy person, and I really enjoy the science. That's my answer to it.
Well, you perfectly put it into word, and I'm sure everybody has their own story and how they can find happiness and the meaning of life. But your perspective also gave us a very well-defined and broad kind of perspective to the whole idea. Well, thank you very much again for coming to the podcast, and we would look forward to have you again, and maybe we can dig deeper into the whole stuff that Saeed is especially working on and discuss it more.
We have no choice, and it's really special.
Yes.
Yeah.
The situation is a bit different. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good questions. Thanks. Good luck with everything.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Dr. Northoff. In this episode, we discuss his path into psychiatry and neuroscience, and what spatiotemporal neuroscience can tell us about mental health and psychiatric disorders. For more information on his work, make sure to take a look at the Northoff Lab website, where you can find his publications, talks, and books.
This is a Dendrite podcast. To support it, please share this episode with your friends and anyone else who might be interested. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and see you next time.